Intelligence numbers, they also then suggest that the Russians, they're stockpiling quite a significant number of ballistic missiles in particular. They stockpile them for other contingencies. And then what are those other contingencies? Well, one of them is a confrontation with NATO. I can't predict the future. I can't look into the heads of decision makers. But I look what the Russians tell us with their capabilities, their production numbers, and their stockpiling. And then I say, okay, let's better be prepared, right? That's all I'm trying to do with my work, is trying to prepare us for the worst case scenario, because that worst case scenario, it's in the room with us.
This is a conversation with Fabian Hoffmann, a doctoral research fellow at the University of Oslo, who's focusing on missiles of all kinds. And he's been doing a fantastic job popularizing and explaining this quite niche topic on his Twitter and Substack. It's quite a sobering conversation. Missiles in general are becoming an increasingly important part of warfare in conflicts from Ukraine to the Middle East, and their importance is only going to grow. And Fabian talks a lot about why he believes that Europe is extremely unprepared for this, why it lacks both defensive and offensive capabilities, while it's falling miles behind Russia, which has drastically increased its production, and why he believes that Russia is actually stockpiling their missiles for a contingency of a war with NATO, rather than just using them in Ukraine. We also talk about how Israel's Iron Dome actually performed in its war with Iran, whether the plan for a Golden Dome that the Trump administration is planning to spend hundreds of billions of dollars on actually makes sense, or why he thinks that Europe's air defense policy is completely wrong, and why unless something changes, it's never going to work. And much, much more. This podcast is supported by Conductor, a crisis exercise company, as well as by its supporters on Patreon, to whom I'm deeply grateful, who make the existence of this podcast possible and who get a bunch of perks, including full ad-free episodes and bonus content. And if you want to get more geopolitical analysis to help you filter all the noise from the stuff that actually matters, you can sign up to my newsletter, where I break down big picture geopolitical stories, trends, and patterns. You can find the link in the description. And now, enjoy the conversation. So, welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
So, I was just saying before we started recording that I'm a big fan of your Substack, and I think that you're doing an excellent job of popularizing quite a niche topic of missiles and their role in conflicts today and the technology around them. And you write a Substack called Missile Matters, which is a great pun with a double meaning. But if I take it at a face value, how much do missiles matter today, and why do they matter?
Sure. I mean, I think what we're seeing over the last couple of years, in different conflicts and wars around the world, obviously in Europe, in the war between Russia and Ukraine, and also in the Middle East, those repeated missile exchanges between Iran and Israel, and then also more recently in South Asia with Pakistan and India. I mean, in all those confrontations, what you saw is that missile capabilities really are key in modern warfare. And if you are planning, or if you think you might fight a modern high-intensity war in the 21st century, you really don't want to be caught in a position where you don't have access to deep missile stocks on your own side. And of course, some capabilities to defend against them, to intercept those of the adversary. So, wherever we look in the world, states are telling us that these weapon systems are really important in their procurement policies. And also when they start fighting, we see the value of these weapon systems, both in offensive and defensive scenarios.
Which I think is especially important since we're both sitting in Europe, and Europe might be one of those places that's probably not the best prepared for that kind of war when it comes to missiles. But let's more on that later, because it's definitely one of the things that I want to talk about. But actually, let's start in the Middle East, where we've recently seen, I think, quite an interesting demonstration of maybe where this capability and technology is today. So obviously in the Iran-Israel 12-day war. And maybe a good way to start would be by one thing that most people have probably heard of, which is Israel's probably the most famous anti-air, anti-missile defense system called Iron Dome. How do you think that it actually performed in the conflict, and do you think it stood up to its reputation for, the most famous and best developed defense of this kind?
Yeah, great question. I mean, Israeli missile defense really is special for two reasons, right? Israel is a fairly small country, so it is relatively easy to cover the entire country with air and missile defense, much more so than for I'd say most other countries in the world, essentially. So right, definitely Ukraine. We see how large that country is, how difficult it has been for Ukraine, not only to defend Kiev and maybe a couple other large population centers, but really every major city from Russian missile attacks. That's just very, very difficult with the limited number of missile defense systems that they have available. And that's not the case for Israel, right? So small country, small territory. But at the same time, right, given the fact that they have been surrounded for decades now by actors that have emphasized missile and rocket capabilities, so airborne projectiles to threaten Israel's security, they obviously then also place doctrinally and operationally large emphasis on missile defense capabilities or projectile defense capabilities. And so you get this mix of small territory but very high density of missile defense capabilities, which in principle, right, allows for what you said, this very reputationally high missile defense system that has a very high reputational standing in the world. And the thing is, it has been tested, throughout the last couple of decades, but really only at the lower tiers. So you can envision the Israeli missile defense system as consisting of three tiers. It has the lower tier, which is Iron Dome, right? The one that is, I think, most famous in popular discourse, which is supposed to defend against, mortar grenades, artillery grenades, smaller rocket artillery that is flying into Israel and intercept those. And it has done so very successfully. Then there's the medium tier, which largely consists of a system called David's Sling. And that is supposed to defend against cruise missiles, smaller ballistic missiles, short-range ballistic missiles, but also long-range drones. And then at the upper tier, you have the Arrow system, which I think, has also been talked about quite a lot, especially in Europe, in light of Germany's procurement of the system, which is supposed to defend against medium-range ballistic missiles and is actually intercepting those outside the atmosphere at a very high altitude. And so over the last decades, the lower tier has repeatedly been tested, including by non-state actors like Hezbollah, Hamas, and those regional proxies of Syria and Iran. And now, over the last year or two, starting in 2024, in April 2024, when Iran launched the first large-scale missile barrage at Israel, that is when you also saw those higher-tier systems in action, particularly Arrow. And obviously, throughout this 12-day war, these systems were tested repeatedly and intensively. So overall, I would say that the missile defense system performed as expected, if not slightly better. So if not slightly overperformed expectations. So by and large, I think prior to the war, analysts, or at least, I can only speak for myself, but I think, other analysts probably would have shared this opinion, that you would have expected an interception rate of around 80 to 90% for Iranian medium-range ballistic missiles. And according to the Israelis, it appears that they intercepted closer to 90%. So at the upper end of that estimate. And there are a couple of reasons why this may have been the case. It is that they got help from the Americans. They deployed 2 THAAD batteries and also naval assets aided in missile defense. You actually saw those lower tier systems that I just explained, that are nominally speaking only supposed to defend against lower range threats, actually defend against medium range ballistic missile projectiles, including Iron Dome, which, something I would have never expected to see. They actually launched Iron Dome interceptors against incoming medium range ballistic missiles, and it worked. And there's at least one confirmed intercept that was caught on video. So that is really, really impressive, really speaks to the quality of those systems. But it also speaks a bit, to the urgency of the situation. If you're launching those types of interceptors, that means you're running low on the higher end, and that was definitely the case, right? So I think and then that was also a really important reason why I was successful is that Israel, they just managed to intercept a lot of missiles before they were launched. I think if they had not done that, we might have reached the point of interceptor depletion, so that Israel would have run out at those higher levels.
Well, that was my next question. If a factor is that the war ended up being pretty short and compared to Ukraine, that's been facing attacks for several years, it must ration the types of anti-air missiles defenses, whereas Israel can kind of just put everything that's out there for the 12 days that the war lasts. And if it was facing an attritional war like Ukraine, probably then the effectivity would go down. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, it's tricky. So I think, we don't know how a war of attrition would have looked like between Israel and Iran, given that it's over now. But I think, Israel would have had some advantages. The most important one, obviously, that they had full control over Iranian skies, right? They had air superiority throughout the country. They had air dominance over large parts of the country. Iran had to, really move its missile capabilities back deeper into the country in order to not be too vulnerable to Israeli strikes, but they still were. You saw over the last couple of days of the war that Iran really only managed to launch minor salvos, right? A handful of missiles, maybe 10, a bit more, but you didn't see like any of those large scale missile salvos at all. So it seems to me in that sense, Israel had it under control to some extent. The other big thing is, right, that I think Iran was not really producing new missiles anymore throughout the war. I think their supply chain probably had been interrupted greatly. I mean, maybe there had been some manufacturing ongoing still. But on the other hand, Israeli manufacturers, they were already in overdrive when it comes to interceptor production, but maybe they've tried to ramp that up even more. Although that's, of course, tricky because it's such a complex supply chain. But at least Israel was still producing probably as much as before the war, if not slightly more. So in that sense, they may have had a slight advantage. As to the question why it ended, I think political factors were more important. I have to emphasize here, I'm not a Middle East expert. Not the greatest at speaking on Iranian and Israeli political objectives and ambitions. But my impression is, right, that Donald Trump, he really wanted to end this just to get himself like this negotiation win. I mean, it seems to me that Trump really is all about negotiating and then bringing an end to negotiations, no matter how it ends. And, very often with Trump, because he's the president of the United States, which is the most important allies to a lot of countries in the world, he actually has more influence pressuring his allies than his adversaries. And he uses that influence to go after his allies more than after his adversaries in these negotiations. And that's the impression that I got from the ceasefire negotiations. I think Israel would have been happy to keep going, ideally with American assistance, but probably also to some extent without them. But they really were pressured by the Americans, potentially by them saying, Trump saying that if you don't end this now, we're going to seize all our support for you. And that would have been difficult for Israel. So I think, Trump as a unitary factor, I think he probably was the most important in bringing this to an end at the timing that it was.
Just a quick break here. If you care about geopolitics, and I assume you do since you're listening to this, you might want to consider signing up to get my newsletter, Station Zero. Once every week or two, you'll get a free geopolitical analysis, a story, trend, or pattern of something that's really important but that most people tend to miss. Like the one where I talk about why there seems to be more and more war and conflict all around the globe. Why it's not just a feeling, but actually a verifiable fact. And why the increase in war can be explained with a niche mathematical theory and the plot of Jurassic Park. And what it means for the future of geopolitics. If you want to sign up, just click the link in the description. And now, back to the conversation. That's a really good point on Trump and pressuring allies more than adversaries. On the other hand, with Iran, how do you assess the Iranian performance and the ability to strike Israel, considering that this is something that they probably were preparing for quite a long time? how do you think they perform?
Yeah, that was in terms of the missile capabilities. I mean, that was a more or less horrible performance. We kind of already saw it in 2024, right? That Iranian ballistic missiles, medium range ballistic missiles, they're a lot less accurate than what was advertised by Iran, also tested by Iran. In fairness, when they launched their ballistic missiles, during test launches in the desert in very controlled environment, they got greater accuracies than what we saw throughout 2024 and 2025. But then in operational environments where things move fast, where there isn't the same time to prepare and respond to the enemy, that accuracy decreased greatly. So those, you typically assess accuracy in terms of CEP, circular error probable, which indicates the smallest radius within which 50% of all missile projectiles launched will land. So 50% fall within that radius, 50% outside of it. And, for a conventional ballistic missile, you really need to get the CEP down to tens of meters, if not meters, because otherwise, we all know the explosive power of a conventional warhead is just not big enough to really create those area effects that you need in order to compensate for larger CEPs. And what we saw in 2024 and now again in 2025, Iranian missiles, they have a CEP, so those medium-range ballistic missiles, they have a CEP of hundreds of meters. And, that's enough if you're just launching them at population centers. Sure, you will hit something, but that's not enough to strike, any kind of target with pinpoint accuracy, or even make very deliberate targeting decisions, even about launching at larger buildings such as headquarters or something like that, which probably for China or the United States, also to some extent Russia, that's not a big of an issue. They can do that, but it definitely was a big deal for Iran. And then, of course, we get back, to the larger strategic question, grand strategy, overall Iranian deterrence posture. As you mentioned correctly, I mean, Iran put enormous emphasis on these missile capabilities, and the fact that they underperformed to such an extent operationally, that is not good news, right? I mean, that kind of tells you that your grand strategy failed. Because Iranian grand strategy was about pressuring Israel and the West and its allies on the one hand with this missile arsenal, on the other hand with proxy actors in the region, right? That can also then wreak havoc not only in the region but potentially also extended influence outside of it, for example, by targeting shipping routes and whatnot. And now one of those elements prior to the war was heavily degraded, right? Of Israel going after Iranian proxies after October 2023, really degrading Hezbollah, really degrading Hamas. Also going after the Houthis to some extent. And now, so like that one element was already kind of failing, right? Or degraded heavily. And now this other big element, the missile capabilities, they also underperformed. And at the same time, right, Iran invested into those capabilities at the expense of others, such as air defense, for example. I mean, if they had mounted a greater air defense challenge, maybe Israel would not have been able to achieve this level of air superiority and air dominance that they had, but simply with the amount of money that they invested in those capabilities and the ones that they had available, that was just not feasible. So it is a grand strategic failure in that sense on the Iranian side. And the one thing that really saved them potentially is that the war ended as fast as it did after all.
Yeah. No, I agree. I agree completely. One thing that Iran was doing in this war and also in the clash last year was to try to replace the different types of missiles with drones, long-range drones that I guess in theory can kind of do a similar thing. But to what extent, and I imagine that the logic is that, or the motivation is that they're probably a lot cheaper, because I imagine that ballistic and non-ballistic missiles are probably pretty expensive to make. And Russia is doing the same thing in Ukraine. So to what extent can you replace missiles with drones, and what are the downsides of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question, and comparing the Middle East and Europe really is key here, or Ukraine and Russia, because context really, really matters, right? So broadly speaking, can you replace missiles for drones? And yes, you can, but it's really important to keep in mind that with less costs, so less money that you have to invest in those cheaper long-range strike capabilities, you also get less capability, right? You get less military punch for the capability, the system that you're acquiring. And there are many reasons for that. Obviously, compared to a medium-range ballistic missile, a long-range drone is a lot slower, right? It takes hours to reach the target. The warhead is a lot smaller. I mean, the Shahed drone, for example, now the latest Russian variant, carries a 90-kilogram payload, whereas one of these ballistic missiles that we saw, they were in the range of 500 to 1,000 kilograms of high explosives. So at the explosive power, the lethality is limited in that regard. A medium-range ballistic missile will also have a significant amount of penetrability, so you can penetrate into targets, even into armored targets, to really maximize the damage. So this again speaks to lethality. Whereas a drone, right, it's really slow, it's not very heavy. It will also come at a disadvantageous angle very often. The penetrability is very, very limited. So really the only target that you can go after is like soft targets, right, that are not armored. Whereas armored targets are absolutely vulnerable to these larger ballistic missiles. So those are like a lot of the trade-offs, right? And then the one thing that long-range drones can do very, very effectively, and we see them do that in Ukraine, is to saturate and perhaps oversaturate the enemy missile defense system. By just launching hundreds of projectiles into the airspace that a defender then has to deal with. And on the one hand, right, there is an issue with the overall saturation, right? If I have just enough projectiles in my airspace, it may be hard to keep track. But then, in the Ukrainian context, given that Russia has been launching these drones against population centers, right, very indiscriminatory, just against apartment blocks, that basically means for Ukraine, they have to take all of them down, because if they don't do that, that means, you put your population at harm. I mean, from a military perspective, it sounds awful, but from a military perspective, it doesn't really matter if the drone hits your apartment building, right? That is just something that you feel like you have to do, because otherwise your population suffers, and so you should do it. But that, of course, then is really expensive, and it's tricky because you have to deploy air defense assets, let's say, away from other more critical areas, but you also have to employ interceptors that by their nature, by definition, are very expensive, often more expensive than the long-range drone itself, in order to shoot it down. So overall, you impose a heavy opportunity cost on your adversary, right? And your adversary just has to make a lot of tough choices in that moment when you launch hundreds of long-range drones into its airspace. At least that's what Ukraine is experiencing. But all of this is a lot less effective in the Middle East, and that's for a range of factors. And the most important one is geography, and just the way that the geopolitical space is structured right now. Right. So when Iran launches its drones, the Israelis, they know immediately. They alert other regional actors, and then together these drones are and were intercepted even before reaching Israeli airspace, or just when they started to reach Israeli airspace, and with fighter aircraft, right? Often, either employing short-range air-to-air missiles, sometimes also just machine guns. Helicopters also play a role, and that's quite a cost-effective way then of taking down those cheaper drones. But Ukraine can't really do that because the airspace is so contested that, fighter aircraft can really operate deeper behind the front line. So there will be, quite a while where Russian drones can fly somewhat uncontested in Ukrainian airspace. Obviously, there's also no real chance at taking them down before they reach the airspace. And also, it's just a question of airframe availability compared to the numbers of drones that are launched by Russia. So Ukraine, they can probably launch a handful, maybe a few dozen of fighter aircraft in the event of a large-scale drone attack. And that may be too little to intercept all of those drones, right? Which again fly over a very large country. Whereas for Israel, they can also launch a handful of fighter aircraft, maybe also a few dozen, but then compared to the small size of their territory and with the help that they're getting or they've been getting from, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, also from the United States, the UK in helping intercepting those drones, that's just a lot easier. So overall, right, drones can be a great tool, but context really matters. And for Russia, they're really, really effective. Whereas for Iran, for a number of reasons, they've proven, I think, fairly ineffective.
Just a quick break here to let you know that the corporate sponsor of this podcast is Conductor, which provides software for crisis exercises for everything from cyber threats and supply chain security to hybrid warfare. Thank you, Conductor, for sponsoring this podcast. And now, back to the conversation. So let's move to Ukraine, because I want to dig deeper into what you were saying. Because what is, you were sort of talking about the difficulties that Ukraine faces in the air defense against, for a number of reasons, against Russian attacks, both missiles and drones. So what is their approach to that, or their strategy of how they actually deal with that? If they're basically being constantly attacked by a much larger number of drones and missiles than that they can shoot down, and they can, I don't know if that's still the case, but I imagine they maybe have to ration the number of missiles that they can shoot things down with. So what is their approach now? What are they focusing on protecting? What are they focusing on shooting down? How does that work?
Yeah, so Ukraine is in a really tricky position right now because they, on the one hand, they don't have the number of missile defense systems, right, fire units that they can deploy around their country to really protect every critical target. And they also really are running out on interceptors, especially interceptors that are used to intercept incoming short-range ballistic missiles. So that would be Patriot, right? Patriot interceptors. And of course, that is now further exacerbated by the stop in aid deliveries that was recently announced to Ukraine by the United States, which included, right, Patriot interceptors. I think there were 30 or so. I think the announcement said there are 30 interceptors that are in Poland right now that were supposed to be delivered to Ukraine, but they haven't been delivered now. And so that makes it really difficult, right? So you don't have enough fire units to protect all of your countries, but all of your high value targets. But at the same time, even where you have fire units, you start running out of interceptors. And so what Ukraine has been doing, and not out of choice, but because they've been forced to do so, is to really prioritize, right? What are the targets that I definitely have to defend? A lot of those are in and around Kiev, so I think Kiev remains fairly well protected. But then, you have other, especially, population centers that are fairly large, but, not among the largest, where there's just a pure lack of missile defense capability. Obviously, there's then also an issue, right? Ukraine has to make a choice between protecting frontline assets versus rear targets. That's a bit more tricky to assess, at least for me. What they've been prioritizing, my understanding is that, with Patriots, especially Patriot fire units, they have been deployed around rear targets, so population centers, critical infrastructure, but that leaves frontline units and frontline high-value equipment fairly vulnerable to Russian short-range ballistic missile strikes against military targets right in the frontline area. So that's tricky. Other systems, IRIS-T, NASAMS, you see those deployed closer to the front line as well, at least in terms of video imagery. But they obviously also deployed quite substantially further back in the territory. So yeah, Ukraine is unfortunately not in a great position, and I'm afraid it's also not going to get better because Russia is, expanding its missile production across all categories: cruise missiles, medium range, short range, and medium range ballistic missiles, and also long range drones. Whereas the West is trying to, right, but they're not keeping up. And then with the United States being the shaky partner that it is, that's sometimes in, sometimes out. Maybe they're out for good now. Who knows? That's not helping at all, right? And then again, what I said earlier, that missile defense is just more expensive than the offensive capabilities very often, just inherently, and it's especially the case right now because because of PPP, right? Purchasing price parity. Russia can just produce a lot cheaper inside Russia than, let's say, Germany can produce interceptors inside Germany, right? So the Russian-built cruise missile will be cheaper because it's built in Russia than the interceptor because it's built in Germany, simply because of cost of labor between the two different countries. And then, of course, you also get into the whole sensor stuff, and the sensor technology is more complicated, more complex in interceptors. That also brings up the price. So it really is a losing game, right? We're trying to keep up with the Russians, but it's not working, and I think it will not work in the long run. So it doesn't really matter how much we're trying to spend there. And I think that that means we have to think differently, and Ukraine is trying to do that, right? Instead of emphasizing missile defense over and over again, they're now trying to emphasize their own long-range strike capabilities. And I will say with quite a lot of success. And the fact that they're now also receiving substantial funding, from Germany, for example, 400 million that was invested in Ukraine's long-range strike capabilities. And I think Denmark right now is also preparing a large financing package. That's good. That's smart. We should do that, and we should do more of that. Of course, we can't fully neglect missile defense, but I think we have to get away from this mindset that the only way or the best way to counter Russian missiles is by building up missile defense. And that counts for Ukraine, right? But that is also a really important lesson for us Europeans inside Europe thinking about fighting a war with Russia.
That's really interesting. So basically, you can't never be able to shoot down everything that Russia sends at you. So the solution to that dilemma is to go on the offensive instead.
Yeah. Maybe one point on that, because I think it's also really important. You will never shoot down everything. That's just statistics, right? Statistically speaking, as I said, right, we would have expected 90% interception rate in 80 to 90% in Israel. They achieved something like 90%, but that means that quite a few of missiles still got through. I think what our policymakers in Europe are trying to tell us is that if we just invest enough into missile defense, and maybe they don't know better, right? I don't think they're necessarily malicious in that. I think they're just uninformed and frankly a bit stupid. But they're bringing across this message that if we just have enough, right, the Russian missile threat will cease to exist. That's just not the case. But even if we also achieve 90% interception rates, which, let's be honest, that will not happen. Absolutely not, because Russia will have a lot easier time oversaturating our missile defenses. Their missile capabilities are also more advanced, right? Iskander, for example, the 9723 short-range ballistic missile that is launched from the Iskander missile system, that can maneuver quite aggressively mid-air, at least compared to Iranian ballistic missiles. And that maneuvering really makes it more difficult to intercept it, right? Because then the interceptor also has to account for the maneuvering of the projectile that it's homing in at. And so, but let's say even if we get 90%, which I think probably in reality would be closer to 60 to 70. But even if it's 90%, if Russia will launch 1,000 missiles at us, which, let's be honest, they will do, that means there's still 100 that are getting through. And we're just not honest about that, I feel like, in Europe, at least our policymakers. I know the militaries know that, and they're trying to also bring across the message to their policymakers. But, for one reason or another, that message is then not translated into procurement priorities. Because if it was, I think we would emphasize more our own counter-strike capabilities, such as Ukraine is doing right now, instead of just, trying to go all in on missile defense, which again, in my view, is a losing game.
That's really interesting. Maybe one thing to clarify, because I always thought that maybe something that would be a limiting factor in this, in the hypothetical scenario that you're talking about of Russia, overwhelming and attacking at scale and overwhelming European air defenses, I always thought that ballistic missiles were extremely expensive. So that Russia wouldn't really be able to do that, or it wouldn't be really able to do that for that long. But maybe I'm wrong on that.
No, so again, PPP plays a huge role here, purchasing price power parity. I don't know. Honestly, I don't know exactly what PPP stands for. But right, like the fact that Russia can just produce a lot cheaper in their own country than we can produce in ours, that plays a huge role. So I recently seen an estimate that a short-range ballistic missile, for the Iskander system, costs Russia to produce somewhere on $400,000. In all honesty, I'm also not the best one to, not that much into defense economics. To me, that number seems plausible. But let's say there is, an uncertainty of 50%. Let's say the real price is 600,000 or 200 to 600,000, maybe even 800,000. Honestly, maybe let's make it even 1 million, right? Because it doesn't matter in that sense. Because American Patriot interceptors, the recent procurement price for those in export contracts is around 3.5 to 4 million US dollars per piece. So at the very least, right, even if an Iskander missile, a short-range ballistic missile, costs you 1 million to produce, which probably is a heavy overestimation, and probably is a lot less, right? It's still 1 to 4. So we would spend 4 times more in missile defense than Russia spends on the offensive capability. If it's indeed 400,000, which the report noted, then it's 1 to 10. So that's really bad. And then the other thing that's also really important to mention here, one interceptor, again has like a certain percentage of percentage chance of killing the incoming projectile. Let's say for a modern Patriot PAC-3 MSE interceptor, right? Very modern, very good system. Let's say that's 80%. So if I launch one at the incoming ballistic missile, I have an 80% chance of intercepting it. Of course, I can allocate 2 interceptors per target. Then I bring up the overall chance of interception to 96%. And if I allocate 3 interceptors, then my overall likelihood of interception will approach 100%. But again, right, allocating 3 interceptors for 1 incoming ballistic missile, that's very, very expensive, and that will drain your arsenal extremely fast. So basically, in Europe, you then also have a choice, and Israel faced the same dilemma, right? That either you allocate 1 interceptor per incoming target, knowing that there is, then a fairly plausible chance that it will get through, or I allocate more than 1 and bring up my likelihood of interception, but then I also train my arsenal a lot faster. So basically, you have a choice between a lot of lower chance intercepts or a significantly lower number of high certainty intercepts. But no matter what, missile defense is more expensive than long range strike, and that's why our policy in Europe is, I think, so unfortunate.
So why do you think that the policies in Europe are the way they are? Do you think that it's just that it's kind of appealing to maybe look at Israel and imagine we can also shield ourselves in an impenetrable air defense shield, and it's much less comfortable to admit that it might not be possible and consider thinking about investing more into strike capability and these issues? Why do you think that the policy issues are there?
Oh, you basically nailed it, right? I think it's very attractive for European policymakers, and in fact, they do that all the time, right? They point at Israel and then they say we need an Iron Dome for Germany or for Europe. I mean, Trump's Golden Dome, right, is also heavily inspired by Israel's Iron Dome. I obviously, again, like this speaks to the fact that those policymakers they very often don't even understand Israeli missile defense, because again, right, the Iron Dome, as I explained earlier, that is only one part of those of the overall missile defense architecture, and only the lowest tier, and I think the least relevant one for for European policymakers, also American policymakers, right? So, but yeah, it's political, right? I think it's a lot easier to invest in a capability that where even in the name it's called defense, right? Missile defense. It's a defensive capability. We're not threatening anyone with that, so it's very easy to make the case for that. Whereas to invest into a capability called conventional long range strike, right? Why do you want to invest into something that strikes the other side? That's offensive. That's bad. We're not offensive, right? We're just trying to protect ourselves. I think that's where the issue lies in a lot of countries. I mean, Germany made it abundantly clear, right? Like there you had that, especially under the last government, you constantly had this discourse about offensive and defensive capabilities, and that we are interested in providing Ukraine with defensive capabilities, but we would never provide them with offensive capabilities. And of course, the same then counts for us, right? Like we don't want to be a threat to Russia, so we have to invest into defensive capabilities, because if we invest into offensive capabilities, that may make things even worse, right? So I think that's where that, and then I mean, probably the military also has some role to play in that, right? I mean, I I think it's also fair to be a bit critical of them. Again, take Germany as the example. Germany has invested some 10 billion euros into missile defense since February 2022, and only a few hundred millions into long range strike. Um, and I think the military, the Air Force, they should have pushed back harder also, right? I mean, they were happy to take the money for obvious reasons, but it would have also been in their responsibility to really make the case that you're reaching a point of diminishing returns where it's much smarter now to invest in our own offensive strike capabilities, because that will improve our defense, our deterrence much more than keep going all in on missile defense. And again, I don't have perfect insights. I don't know. Maybe decision makers, military decision makers, try to make the case. I mean, I've spoken to them, and they say, yeah, we would like more money for offensive strike capabilities. But maybe then it was also, your responsibility to make that case a bit more effectively and guide those policymakers in the right direction. But of course, that's easy said from the outside. We don't know exactly how it looked like.
I think an important thing on that note, or on this discussion, is something that you wrote about recently in one of your Substack posts, which is that Russia is making so many missiles that it is likely, and I'm going to quote, stockpiling missile systems for other contingencies, including a potential NATO-Russia confrontation in Europe. Why do you think so? Thank you for listening to the free part of this interview. The conversation is not over yet, but the next part is only for the paid members on my Patreon or Substack. I try to make the best possible geopolitics content, and I put a lot of effort and time into this podcast. And there's quite a lot of costs that I have to pay that are associated with it. It's the supporters on Patreon that allow me to do all that, and making part of every single interview exclusively available only for them is my way of saying thank you, since without them, it just wouldn't exist. So if you want to listen to the rest of the interview, ask questions to guests who appear on the show, or myself, get bonus content and my own takes on geopolitics, become part of an active community of geopolitics enthusiasts, and most importantly, make the continued existence of this podcast possible, do consider becoming a supporter. It really helps. To join, you can find the link in the description or go to patreon.com/decodinggeopolitics.